So here are the terms. As always, go ahead, write them down, print them out, and be listening for them. Enlightenment ideas helped open people's minds to a new way of thinking and help them see they didn't have to just accept the ways of the past. The ideas challenged old ways of thinking, questioned divine right of rule, taught that people should be able to gain material well-being, social justice, and happiness in this life, not just the next. Many of the European philosophes will have ideas that will have a huge influence on the colonies. For example, John Locke believed that all people have natural rights from birth, ideas or rights such as life, liberty, and property. In the two treatises of government, Locke states the following: government is formed to protect people's natural rights. Government should have limited power. The type of government should be accepted by all citizens. He rejected absolute monarchy and so sides with Parliament against the Stuart kings. The government has an obligation to those it governs. People have the right to overthrow government if it fails its obligations or takes away the natural rights of citizens. He argues that rulers derive power from the consent of the ruled. These are ideas, the same ideas, that are reflected in the U.S. Declaration of Independence. And then there's Montesquieu. In 1748, Montesquieu wrote The Spirit of the Laws, and in this he described checks and balances on government by dividing the functions of power between three separate branches of government to protect freedom and liberty. We can see his ideas about separation of governmental powers reflected in the U.S. Constitution. The separate branches of government that we have are the legislative, judiciary, and the executive. Then there's Voltaire. Voltaire opened people's eyes to the corruption by officials and aristocrats through his writings. His writings allowed others to see the injustice of the slave trade and religious prejudice. Our Declaration of Independence also reflects the corruption of the British government, which hurt the American colonies. Voltaire's writings defended freedom of speech. He was supposed to have said, "I do not agree with a word that you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." Well, our Bill of Rights also stands for freedom of speech. In 1751, Dennis Diderot's encyclopedias were published, spreading the ideas of the Enlightenment to the rest of the world, including the American colonies. Many of our founding fathers were influenced by the ideas contained in these encyclopedias. The colonists were voracious readers, and so as these ideas are spreading throughout Europe, they're also coming over to the colonies, and the colonists are being exposed to them, and they're reading them, and they're really making them think and question. In the mid-18th century, there wasn't much of an indication that there was going to be a revolution. The 13 colonies regarded themselves as British subjects. There was a long history of cultural and personal connections that they had with England. So why was there a revolution? Well, from 1754 to 1763, England and the colonies fought together against France in the French and Indian War. And the war is called the French and Indian War because the British Army and the American colonials were fighting against not just the French army, but the French's Indian allies. Both Britain and France had an interest in the Ohio River Valley. France wanted it for easy travel by water, and the British merchants wanted the furs. And so this was a long, expensive war. And to make matters worse, it was also being fought in Europe at the same time under the name the 7 Years' War, because it lasted for 7 years. Well, in the end, the British win. and their victory ensures their global dominance and North American prosperity. The French have to leave North America. With France gone, the Americans no longer needed the protection of the British, but the British soldiers remain in the colonies. And then the British began to think, well, okay, we just spent a lot of money fighting this war, and it was really expensive. It's drained our treasury. How are we going to get some of that money back? How can we recoup some of that? Who's going to pay for all of this? And then they realize, the colonists. We fought it for them. They need to repay us. So, in an effort to replenish their dwindling treasury, the British begin to tax the colonists. Their attitude is, we bore the cost of this war to help protect you from the French. Now you need to repay us. And here you can see part one of the results of this war. This map shows North America before the French and Indian War. And you can see the territory controlled by Spain. You see the English colonies along the eastern seaboard. And then you see New France, which, as you can tell from this map, was a large empire. Here you see the aftermath of the French and Indian War. France leaves the New World, North America. The Treaty of Paris is the treaty that ended this war, and Britain gains not just territory in what's today the United States, but also Canada. So Britain greatly enlarges its territory over here. The king, who came to power near the end of the French and Indian War, and who will lead the country through the American Revolution, was King George III. And an interesting story about George III. He actually suffered from a condition which, at the time, nobody had a name for. They didn't know what was wrong with him. But he would suffer from physical ailments as well as mental impairment. He would actually lose his mind for periods of time. And he spent many years being, air quoted, treated by physicians who would be brought in from all over Europe, and a lot of them were quacks. Many of them had no idea what they were doing, but the royal family was desperate, and so they tried all sorts of oddball treatments on him, including he spent quite a bit of time at one point in a straitjacket. Well, he leads the country through the American Revolution. He ends up, as we know, losing the colonies, and some sources say that this really sent him over the edge, and his bouts of madness grew worse and worse, and finally he's going to end up just really out of commission for more than a decade. If you've ever heard of Regency England, that's the final years of his reign. You see here that he ruled till 1810. He wasn't really ruling. That final decade plus, his son, George IV, actually was ruling for him as regent, thus the name Regency England, while George III was confined because he had totally lost his mind and never came back. Today, they know the name of the ailment. It was porphyria. But as I said, at the time, they had no idea what they were dealing with. So the British government decides to start taxing the colonists to try to recoup some of the money they spent in the French and Indian War. They introduced the Sugar Act. Now, this is a tax on things like sugar and molasses. The colonists were not happy. Then there was the Stamp Act. This taxed paper goods, which bore a seal or a stamp. So you would buy stationery, magazine, newspaper, playing cards. All of those things would be taxed. There was the Quartering Act. This meant that there could be a knock on your door. It might be a British officer, and you would be forced to house and feed British troops. You would have no say in the matter. And then finally, the Tea Act. this taxed the most popular of all of the English beverages. And the colonists, as you can imagine, were really not happy about this. They were enraged. Well, the colonists, as I said, they're furious, and they begin to boycott British products and to attack British officials. And we start to see violence. In 1770, for example, a group of angry colonists began gathering outside a customs house in Boston. And the soldiers, the British soldiers, on duty, had orders not to fire. But the colonists come. First, they start hurling insults at the soldiers. The soldiers don't react. Then they start throwing snowballs at the soldiers. They don't react. Then somebody starts throwing snowballs with stones in them. And unfortunately, a shot was fired into the crowd. In the end, 5 colonists were killed. Now, the British and the colonists viewed this very differently. The British called it the incident on King Street. Paul Revere was a colonist. He was an engraver and a silversmith. He really resented British power. So he created an engraving which was not entirely accurate, and you see it here on this slide. He called it the Bloody Massacre. So you can compare these two, the incident on King Street, the Bloody Massacre. The name itself, the Bloody Massacre, just enraged the colonists. And as you can see by looking at this, it looks like a bloodbath. It looks like the soldiers are just mowing down the colonists. That's not what happened. But the result is that this engraving is printed in newspapers, spread throughout the colonies, and all up and down the eastern seaboard. Within just a couple of weeks, you've got irate colonists who want revenge. The colonists continue to protest. In 1773, a group of colonists dressed as Indians sneaked onto a British ship anchored in Boston Harbor and dumped 45 tons of tea into the harbor. They were protesting the Tea Act. This was equivalent to $12 million today. And as you can imagine, the British were not amused. It's believed that many of these colonists were actually members of the Sons of Liberty, which was a group of colonists who met and just came up with ideas of what they could do to protest British power. Well, the British, as I said, they're not happy at all. The British respond with a series of acts that the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, because they were intolerable to the colonists. They were designed to punish the colonists. And so this just stirred up the resentment even more, made the colonists even more furious at the British. So the battle cry of the colonists comes to be no taxation without representation. They believed it was very unfair that Parliament was making decisions for them without allowing them to have a voice. But, think about this. Is this really what they wanted? Did they really want a representative in Parliament? Not really. The reality was that they wanted independence. They wanted to be free from the British. So the colonists begin to organize themselves, and in 1774, the Continental Congress is formed. This was a representative body formed of 12 of the 13 colonies. So 12 of the 13 colonies, all of them except for Georgia, sent representatives to come to Philadelphia and to begin to coordinate their resistance to British policies. And I do want to add that the colonists' representatives here at the Continental Congress at first were kind of divided as to what their goals were. Each of the colonies had its own legislative body, and so they were like independent entities already. And so many of the representatives showed up at the Continental Congress with their own agenda, and they didn't necessarily agree. For example, two of the colonies actually wanted to try to just make it work with Britain, whereas most of the others are like, nope, sorry, we need to declare our independence. And it became very clear as time passed that the colonies were headed towards revolution. They realized that the only way they're going to gain their independence is to fight for it. And so they begin to move towards war. So here you see the eastern seaboard, the 13 British colonies in the tannish yellow color. And these are the colonies that are going to start unifying so that they can fight against Britain and declare their independence. But as they move towards war, loyalties are divided. You've got the Patriots. Now, this was the majority of the population, and they supported the revolution. They wanted to fight against Britain, declare their independence. But about 20% of the population, the Loyalists or the Tories, remain loyal to the British monarchy. So imagine what that would do is you declare your independence from the British, you start this revolution, you might be living right next door to someone who's against it, who's really supporting the people you're fighting. Think of the impact of that. And then there's also other groups who remain neutral. People like the Quakers, who are anti-war. And then lastly, you've got some groups who were divided. And what I mean by that is some of them sided with the British, some of them sided with the colonists. Most notably, you have the Native Americans and the African Americans. There were various tribes of Native Americans, for example, who fought with the British, and then others who fought with the colonists. So as we move into this revolution, we don't have 100% of the population supporting it. Finally, on a fateful spring morning in 1775, in April, the first shots are fired. The British had been given information that the colonists had been stockpiling weapons. And so they send troops, the British send troops to Lexington and Concord, two towns in Massachusetts. They arrive in Lexington to arrest several of the colonial leaders, only to find the militia and the Minutemen waiting for them. Now, the Minutemen were members of the colonial militia who had been specially chosen to train, and they could be ready to fight in a minute, at a moment's notice. And so there were about 240 of them waiting for the British. And this is where, as it said, the shot heard round the world was fired. Now, somebody asked me years ago what kind of bullet was used that this could be heard everywhere. That wasn't the case. It was not literally heard around the world. Rather, it's symbolic, because this is the shot that is going to start a revolution that is going to have a huge impact on other nations around the world. And in the brief scuffle, 7 colonists are killed. The British then proceed on to Concord. However, they don't realize that the colonists have been warned. You may have grown up hearing about Paul Revere, riding through the night, telling the colonists, the British are coming, the British are coming. Well, he did that along with several other men. They didn't actually say the British are coming because some of the people they would be talking to were British, those loyalists, but they did warn the colonists of what was going to occur, of what the plan on the part of the British was. And so the result of that is that as the British troops are approaching Concord and they're being joined by other British troops fortifying them, they are being met by the colonial militias who are coming from neighboring areas. And there is another fight. More shots are fired, and quite a few British end up being injured and killed by the colonists. They were totally unprepared for what they faced, because the colonists are hiding in trees, behind buildings. It's guerrilla warfare, and this is not something the British were used to. But, as I said, this is what starts the American Revolution. At the outset, both sides had advantages. The colonists, for example, had the logistic advantage. They're fighting on familiar territory. They're using non-traditional methods of warfare, for example, guerrilla warfare. They also had popular support because the majority of the population was behind their effort. They had support of British rivals. Britain was one of the most powerful nations on earth at that time, but they had a lot of enemies. For example, France. Countries that are more than willing to help fight against them. And France will later, down the road, join the revolution on the side of the colonists. The colonists had George Washington. He was a military man who had honed his skills in the French and Indian War, and now he becomes the leader of the Continental Army once it's formed. And he provides imaginative military leadership. Britain also had advantages. They had a strong central government. They had a navy and an army. Plus, they had that loyalist population who's still supporting them. They also had a lot of money. Both sides had disadvantages as well. For example, the colonies were not 100% unified, not all behind this effort. Remember those divisions I mentioned. When this war started, the colonies didn't even have an army or a navy. They had the militia, people who were not trained to be soldiers. Yes, the Continental Army will be formed, but it was very difficult to sustain it at times. My next point is that it was harder for the Continental Congress to raise money than it was for the British Parliament, and there were many instances where there wasn't enough money to buy the army the things it needed to fight. At the same time, at the beginning of the war, especially when many of the militia were fighting, they weren't totally dedicated. George Washington would have instances where he would get up in the morning and find that a portion of his army was gone. They were farmers. They were going home to tend to their crops. The British also had some disadvantages. Distance. They're fighting a war far from home. That means that it's harder. It takes longer for orders to be given and carried out, for supplies to be sent, and so forth. Also, the British were not used to guerrilla warfare. They were used to the traditional methods of warfare, and the colonists weren't necessarily using that. And then the British population, they are not all behind the war, and that's important because that means they're not necessarily going to want to continue funding this war. Thomas Paine was an Englishman, and he had met Benjamin Franklin in London, and in 1774 he came to America, to Philadelphia. And there he began to write, and he wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense that became hugely popular in the colonies. Basically, this was a pamphlet which called for the American colonists to declare independence from Britain so they could have the freedoms brought by natural laws and put an end to ancient prejudice and tyranny. He believed in the themes of the Enlightenment, and he wanted all men to join him in these beliefs. And so this pamphlet went a long way towards doing that, because it was printed and reprinted, spread throughout the colonies. The colonists read it, and many of them wanted to act about it, or act on the ideas it contained. The colonists write the Declaration of Independence, signed on July 4th of 1776, something we celebrate every summer. And here we see the influence of John Locke's idea of the retention of individual rights and sovereignty based on the consent of the ruled. Thomas Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence, which reflected the ideas of Locke and other Enlightenment thinkers. So what were some of those ideas? There's the idea that every individual is born with rights, unalienable or natural rights. Each person has them just by virtue of being human. There's the idea that the government is there to protect these rights. That's its function. The government gains power from the consent of those it governs. And if the government doesn't do what it's supposed to do, doesn't protect those rights, the people have the right to abolish an unjust government. That's what the colonists believe they have the right to do. The Declaration of Independence also states that Britain had taken away the colonists' natural rights, that people have the right to abolish an unjust government, and they have the right to set up a new government which would protect them. So this document first lays out the rights that the colonists have, then talks about how the British abuse those rights and what rights the colonists have in order to fix it. This document officially declared the colonists' independence from Britain, and it was unique for its time. It will inspire others. By 1780, war weariness had begun to set in. People on both sides were tired of fighting. And finally, in October 1781, the British were surrounded at Yorktown, Virginia. They surrendered. So this was a huge American victory. But the British military continued to fight. But the Battle of Yorktown's important because it turned the British public against the war. And the following March, there's a new parliament that's a pro-American parliament. They're elected, and peace negotiations begin in earnest. Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and a man named John Jay met with the British in the hopes of securing a peace treaty. And the Americans ended up playing off European rivalries to reach a favorable agreement. The Treaty of Paris is signed in 1783, and this ends the American Revolution. The British agreed to recognize American independence as far west as the Mississippi River. Americans agreed to honor debts owed to the British merchants from before the war. They also agreed to stop persecuting the British loyalists. So the war is over, and David had triumphed over Goliath. These puny colonists who started this war without even a military end up defeating the greatest nation, most powerful military on earth at that time. Independence was finally achieved. Afterwards, we'll see the ideas of the Enlightenment also being used in our Constitution. For example, there are the ideas of a social contract to set up the government to be governed by the people, to preserve their natural rights, and to rule for the good of the whole. The federal government was separated into 3 branches, which, according to Montesquieu, would provide checks and balances to govern them. The Constitution recognized that people had basic rights that the government must protect. It stated that all men have the right to freedom of religion, speech, the press, trial by jury, to hold private property, to bear arms, the right to a speedy trial, and so on and so on. The American Constitution set up a representative government with an elected legislature to do the will of the people. And these are ideas that the philosophes of the Enlightenment were trying to implement in society. And so our society, our country, is the result of the spread of many of these ideas being implemented.